It's all very well to jump up and down and say you disagree with something. But if by jumping up and down you're detrimenting your ability to help those same people you're pretending to help in the first place, we as side opposition don't stand for it. And that's why in today's debate we're going to be proving to you that in order to help these people in need, in order to help this situation, the best way is not to cut diplomatic ties. The best way is to embrace those ties and use those to change and make a better future. So before I move on to my main rebuttal for today, I'd like to just clear up a policy that side proposition had at the beginning. And we firstly say that we think it's deeply contradictory for them to cut diplomatic ties, but at the same time support economic ties with these countries. Why? Because they're saying that on the one hand they aren't going to negotiate, they aren't going to talk to them, but they're prepared to help them out, they're prepared to benefit them. The result of this is we think you're either going to need to, if you are going to set the precedent as they wanted to, that you have no part, that you don't agree with what these countries are doing, you're going to have to cut these areas whereby you're helping and benefiting them. The result is you're going to have to include economic policies in your ties as well. So with that, let's now move on to their main points for today. And their first point was, no thank you, their first point was that they believed South Africa had a responsibility to these people in terms of upholding its constitution, and that it needed to act because of this. And we say that we don't have to act by cutting ties. We can act by actively using those ties to manipulate and push those countries in the right direction. We believe that's the action we want, and if we show to our people and that our policy is that this is a more effective way of acting, no thank you, we believe that upholds our constitution. That's far more important. So now moving on to the next point, in terms of will this actually work? And I'll be dealing with this a lot in my matter itself. But firstly, in terms of dealing with them, whereby they said that Africa will be deeply influential on these fellow African countries because of our ties with them. And we would say that our ties with these countries depend on the fact that they see we are an ally. We're a friendly neighbor, we work with them. And we think that when we say we're now going to cut talking to them, we're going to abandon them, we don't promote to them that this is something serious. We promote to them that we're now their enemy, we're like the West. We don't think that that's going to be influential. What's more, we think when you, and the rest of this point I'll be dealing with in my point and I'll flag it later. So with that, I'm now going to be moving on to my points for today, and I have two essential points. The first is why it's not going to be effective to cut ties as opposed to using those ties. My second point is why this is detrimental for South Africa and why we should prioritize looking after ourselves before moving on to dealing with these other countries. No, thank you. So now moving on to my first point, my first part of the point, which is why it's not effective. We would firstly say that we don't think you're actually going to create change in these countries. Why? Firstly, we think in the case of where these countries aren't developing countries, where these countries are America, where they're a lot bigger than us, we don't have that greater influence over them, and by cutting ties we're simply going to detriment ourselves. We aren't going to affect them in any great or meaningful way. So the majority of this debate is going to be about fellow African or fellow developing countries that we can actually influence. And the first thing is that we don't think we actually are going to manage to get them to change legislature, and this is where I'll be dealing with their point. Why? Because we think when you cut diplomatic ties, you back these politicians into a corner. You make them say to their people, to the country, that either they have no authority, that they listen to these countries, that they have that they have no authority or ability to rule the country. They listen to whatever another country is telling them to do. The result of this is we think they're more likely to rebel, they're going to be stubborn, they aren't actually going to listen to us, and they aren't going to change their laws. But now moving on to the next part of this point, and this is even if they are going to change those laws, we don't think it's actually going to change the situations for these people. Why? Because the problems where homosexuals are being abused, whereby they're being attacked, whereby these people are whereby they face daily punishment, isn't a result of these laws, but it's a result of the society. A society which either has religion, persecution against them, or the people in that society have been raised against homosexuality, have been raised to believe that it's an evil. The result of this is when you change the law, you don't change anything because these people are still going to be persecuting them. The law officers are going to turn a blind eye. They themselves are probably going to still continue to persecute because they don't believe in the law. And the result is changing the laws isn't going to be effective. So now moving on to the last part of this point, and this is why it's so beneficial for Africa to maintain these ties and why they can actually change the situation. And the first is, we would say, in the case of developing countries, a lot of these religious, or in cases where they're persecuting homosexuals, is a result of, one, the people having a lack of education, or secondly, have a lack of moral consideration. We would say this is because they mostly focused on the fact of their daily lives and surviving now today, as opposed to looking at the bigger picture. The result of this is, we think, when we help these countries to develop, we naturally create a situation whereby these laws are taken, or whereby these laws or the societal perception is changed. Because they start to take into account greater moral pictures, they start to get educated and realize that this is wrong. We would want to help these countries to develop in order to get that benefit. No, thank you. The second is that we think we can push them with our ties. We can say that, well, we are going to cut ties, we will help you more if you start to move your people in these ways. If you encourage them not to persecute, if you encourage to take away these laws. In this way, we don't back them into a corner, I'll take you in a moment, but we still allow ourselves to create that change. Yes.
If you concede the harm, then how can you suggest a policy in which the only actual action you take is to hope and pray?
The action we're taking, man, is to push these countries in the right direction. The first is to develop them to a situation where they're more likely to deal with these problems. The second is to coerce them to deal with these problems by giving them incentives, by keeping our economic ties. So now let's move on, and as opposed to cutting them, which is what you want, which that backs them into a corner, and I've already dealt with this in my point. So now moving on to the next part, and this is in terms of, and now moving on to the next reason why it's important to maintain these ties in order to create change. We think it's very beneficial for them to have ties with a country that is progressive, that shows them that, look, these ideas might be wrong. And by cutting ties, we push them to the extremist, into the extreme. We think when we cut ties from a country that is actually, when we cut ties from these countries, we push them away from places, we push them away from this constitution, we push them away to the extremist areas whereby they just worried about their religious persecution, whereby they have no example to look up to see that this is wrong. So now moving on to my last point, and this is in terms of the detriment to South Africa. And what we'll say very simply is the reason we have these ties in the first place is because South Africa gains benefit from these ties. The result is, by cutting these ties, you are detrimenting South Africa, you are detrimenting the people of South Africa, and you're detrimenting our ability to work together to build a better Africa. What's more, we think you should prioritize the people of our country, because these are the people that our government has been given power by. These are the people that the government has been voted in by. These are the people who the government should be prioritizing as opposed to other countries. But that's assuming but not conceding that our policy is helping these other countries in the first place. And the result of this is that instead of just standing up for something that isn't actually going to help, we as side opposition today are here to actually make the change, to actually have a far better way of changing these countries for the better and helping these people in need. And that is why we are so very proud today to oppose.